Today, we bring you through one of the most impactful events recorded in the Philippines during the war. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In March 1945, Canadian nurse Abigail Miller documented what she described as the strangest encounter of her 18-month deployment in the Pacific Theater. Her handwritten report, filed with the Red Cross station in Manila, contains details that military censors initially classified. The document remained buried in administrative files until 1945, when it surfaced during the reorganization of medical records. Miller's account begins with a routine patrol along the northern perimeter of Camp O'Donnell, a former Japanese installation that Allied forces had converted into a temporary medical facility. The camp sat 25 kilometers northeast of Manila, positioned strategically near the confluence of three rivers that provided natural barriers against potential infiltration. According to Miller's report, dated March 21, 1945, she was conducting her standard evening rounds when she heard what she initially mistook for animal sounds coming from the dense vegetation beyond the camp's wire perimeter. The sounds, she noted, occurred in intervals that suggested human speech rather than wildlife. Miller documented that she approached the fence line at approximately 18:30 hours. The noise had persisted for nearly 20 minutes by then, creating enough concern that she considered alerting the camp's security detail. Instead, she chose to investigate alone, a decision that her supervisor would later question during the formal inquiry. The terrain beyond Camp O'Donnell consisted of dense tropical undergrowth interspersed with rice paddies that had been abandoned during the Japanese occupation. Local farmers had fled the area in 1942, leaving behind irrigation channels that had since become overgrown with vegetation. These channels created natural corridors through the landscape, pathways that both Allied and Japanese forces had used for movement during the preceding 3 years. Miller's report states that she followed the sounds to a section of fence where the wire had been previously damaged by shelling. The gap, approximately 2 meters wide, had been marked for repair but remained open due to material shortages. Through this opening, she could observe the abandoned rice paddies and the network of irrigation ditches that extended toward the foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains. What Miller discovered next formed the central mystery that would occupy military investigators for the remainder of 1945. Her report describes finding 3 individuals in Japanese military uniforms positioned near one of the larger irrigation channels. 2 of the figures appeared to be supporting or carrying a third, who showed no signs of independent movement. The initial observation lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which Miller remained concealed behind the damaged fence section. Her training as a military nurse had taught her to document observations with clinical precision, a skill that proved valuable when investigators later questioned the accuracy of her account. Miller noted several details that contradicted standard assumptions about Japanese forces in the area. The uniforms, while clearly military in origin, showed signs of modification that suggested extended field deployment. Patches had been removed or altered, and the fabric showed wear patterns consistent with months rather than weeks of continuous use. More significantly, the 3 individuals displayed behavior that differed markedly from what Allied intelligence had documented about Japanese military protocol. Rather than maintaining formation or following established movement patterns, the 2 mobile figures appeared to be providing care or assistance to their incapacitated companion. The incapacitated figure, according to Miller's report, showed no response to verbal communication from the other 2. This observation proved crucial to subsequent investigations. as it suggested either severe injury or a medical condition that required continuous assistance. Miller's decision to approach the three figures directly violated multiple camp protocols. Her report acknowledges this breach, but provides no clear explanation for her actions. Military psychologists who later reviewed the case suggested that Miller's medical training may have overridden her security awareness when she recognized signs of a medical emergency. The approach occurred at approximately 1900 hours, as daylight began to fade over the abandoned rice paddies. Miller's report describes crossing the irrigation channel and walking directly toward the three figures, calling out in English to announce her presence. The response, according to Miller's account, defied her expectations. Rather than fleeing or adopting defensive positions, the two mobile figures remained stationary while calling out in what Miller believed to be Japanese. The tone, she noted, suggested urgency rather than hostility. Miller's background included basic Japanese language training that allowed her to recognize certain military terms and medical vocabulary. Her report indicates that she heard repeated use of what sounded like medical terminology, though she could not provide exact translations. The incapacitated figure, identified in Miller's report only as a young woman, showed no response to external stimuli. Miller's medical assessment, conducted under field conditions, suggested paralysis affecting the lower extremities. The woman's vital signs appeared stable, but her condition clearly required immediate medical intervention. Miller's report documents her attempts to communicate with the two mobile figures, who she identified as male based on their physical characteristics and uniform details. Neither individual appeared to speak English, but both demonstrated understanding when Miller indicated her intention to provide medical assistance. The transportation of the incapacitated woman to Camp O'Donnell required careful coordination between Miller and the two Japanese figures. Miller's report describes a process that took nearly 2 hours and involved carrying the woman across difficult terrain in complete darkness. Medical records from Camp O'Donnell indicate that the woman, subsequently identified through Red Cross documentation as Keiko Tanaka, arrived at the facility at approximately 21:30 hours on March 21st. Her condition was listed as traumatic spinal injury with complete loss of sensation and mobility below the waist. The two male figures who had been caring for Keiko disappeared before camp security could process them as prisoners of war. Miller's report states that they departed immediately after ensuring that Keiko had been transferred to medical personnel, despite her attempts to convince them to remain for medical evaluation. Subsequent investigation revealed that Keiko Tanaka had been serving as a civilian interpreter with Japanese forces in the Philippines. Her personnel file, recovered from abandoned Japanese administrative records, indicated that she had been assigned to liaison duties between military units and local civilian populations. The circumstances surrounding Keiko's injury remained unclear despite extensive questioning by Allied intelligence officers. Medical examination confirmed that her spinal injury was consistent with a fall from height, but no specific incident had been documented in available Japanese military records. Keiko's initial interviews, conducted through a Japanese-American interpreter, provided limited information about the events leading to her injury. She acknowledged that the two men who had cared for her were members of her unit, but declined to provide their names or military identification numbers. Miller's subsequent reports document her daily interactions with Keiko during the 6-week period that the young woman remained at Camp O'Donnell. These reports, filed weekly with the Medical Administration Office, provide insights into both women's perspectives on their unusual encounter. The medical treatment available at Camp O'Donnell was limited to basic care and pain management. Facilities for treating spinal injuries were minimal. and transfer to more advanced medical facilities required authorization that proved difficult to obtain for civilian prisoners. Miller's reports indicate that she spent significant time attempting to understand the circumstances that had led to Keiko's condition. These conversations, conducted through a combination of broken English and basic Japanese phrases, revealed details that had not emerged during official interrogations. According to Miller's notes, Keiko had been traveling with a small unit tasked with recovering administrative records from abandoned Japanese positions. The mission had been assigned high priority because these records contained information about civilian populations that might be valuable for post-war reconstruction efforts. The unit had been operating in territory that was technically under Allied control, but remained largely unsecured due to the rapid pace of the Japanese withdrawal. This situation created opportunities for small Japanese groups to conduct brief missions in areas where they were unlikely to encounter significant Allied resistance. Keiko's injury had occurred during an attempt to retrieve documents from a building that had been damaged by previous fighting. The structure, located in a village approximately 15 kilometers from Camp O'Donnell, had been used as a local administrative center during the Japanese occupation. Miller's notes suggest that Keiko fell through a weakened floor section while searching the building's upper level. The fall resulted in immediate paralysis, leaving her unable to walk or feel sensation in her lower body. The two men who had cared for Keiko were identified in her accounts as Sergeant Hiroshi Yamamoto and Corporal Takeshi Nakamura. Both had been assigned to provide security for the document recovery mission and had remained with Keiko following her accident. Rather than abandoning their injured companion or attempting to return to Japanese lines, Yamamoto and Nakamura had chosen to care for Keiko while seeking medical assistance. This decision placed them at considerable personal risk, as discovery by Allied forces would likely result in capture or worse. Miller's documentation indicates that the two men had improvised a stretcher using materials salvaged from the damaged building. They had then spent several days moving slowly through the countryside, avoiding both Allied patrols and Filipino guerrilla units while searching for medical help. The decision to approach Camp O'Donnell had apparently been made only after other options had been exhausted. Miller's notes suggest that Yamamoto and Nakamura had observed the facility for several days before determining that it was being used for medical rather than purely military purposes. The approach to Miller herself had been carefully planned. The two men had apparently watched the camp's routines long enough to identify her as medical personnel and to determine the timing of her evening rounds. Miller's relationship with Keiko evolved during the weeks following the initial encounter. Despite the language barrier and the unusual circumstances of their meeting, the two women developed what Miller described as a professional friendship based on shared understanding of medical needs and basic human compassion. Keiko's condition showed no signs of improvement during her stay at Camp O'Donnell. Medical evaluation confirmed that her spinal injury had resulted in permanent paralysis, though pain sensation gradually returned to some areas of her lower body. The administrative challenge of determining Keiko's status occupied significant attention from camp officials throughout her stay. As a civilian interpreter, rather than a uniformed combatant, her legal classification remained unclear under existing protocols for prisoner processing. Red Cross representatives who interviewed Keiko documented her request to be repatriated to Japan once medical transportation became available. However, the logistics of arranging such transportation for a disabled civilian prisoner presented complications that delayed any resolution of her case. Miller's advocacy for Keiko's proper medical care created tension with camp administrators, who viewed resources as limited and priorities as clear. These conflicts, documented in Miller's personnel file, reflected broader questions about the treatment of civilian prisoners who required specialized medical attention. The search for Yamamoto and Nakamura continued throughout April 1945, though with limited success. Allied intelligence units interviewed local civilians and examined abandoned Japanese positions, but found no trace of the two men who had delivered Keiko to medical care. Filipino guerrilla units reported occasional sightings of small Japanese groups moving through the countryside, but none of these reports could be definitively connected to Yamamoto and Nakamura. The fluid nature of the military situation made tracking specific individuals extremely difficult. Miller's reports during this period document her growing concern about Keiko's psychological state as well as her physical condition. The young woman had become increasingly withdrawn and showed signs of depression that Miller attributed to both her medical situation and her separation from her companions. Efforts to locate Keiko's family in Japan proved unsuccessful due to the disruption of communication systems and the general chaos surrounding the Japanese surrender process. Red Cross officials indicated that family tracing efforts would need to wait until more stable administrative systems could be established. The broader context of the war's conclusion created additional complications for individual cases like Keiko's. As Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, resources were increasingly focused on major military operations rather than the management of civilian prisoners. Miller's final report on Keiko, dated May 15, 1945, documented the young woman's transfer to a Red Cross facility in Manila, where more specialized medical care might be available. The transfer had been arranged through Miller's persistent advocacy with medical administration officials. The departure from Camp O'Donnell marked the end of Miller's direct involvement with Keiko's case, though she continued to seek information about the young woman's welfare through Red Cross channels. These inquiries yielded limited results due to the administrative confusion surrounding the war's end. Miller's personnel file includes a commendation for her handling of the Keiko situation, though this recognition was accompanied by a formal reprimand for violating security protocols. The contradiction reflected broader tensions within military medical services about the appropriate response to humanitarian situations. The search for documentation about Yamamoto and Nakamura continued sporadically through the summer of 1945. Japanese military records recovered during the surrender process contained no references to the document recovery mission that had led to the initial encounter. Some investigators theorized that the mission had been unofficial, possibly undertaken by the three individuals without proper authorization. This theory would explain the absence of documentation and the willingness of Yamamoto and Nakamura to risk capture while caring for their injured companion. Alternative theories suggested that the documentation might have been destroyed during the general destruction of records that accompanied the Japanese retreat from the Philippines. Many units had been ordered to eliminate materials that might be valuable to Allied intelligence operations. Miller's post-war correspondence includes several letters requesting information about Keiko's whereabouts and condition. These letters, addressed to various Red Cross and military administration offices, reflect her continued concern for the young woman she had encountered in such unusual circumstances. Responses to Miller's inquiries were typically bureaucratic and unhelpful. Standard form letters acknowledged her requests, but provided no specific information about individual cases due to privacy considerations and administrative limitations. The final documented reference to Keiko appears in a Red Cross report, dated September 1945. The report lists her among civilians being processed for potential repatriation to Japan, but provides no details about her medical condition or ultimate disposition. Miller's attempts to maintain contact with Keiko through Red Cross channels proved unsuccessful. The massive scale of population movements and administrative challenges during the post-war period made tracking individual cases extremely difficult, particularly when those cases involved disabled civilians. The question of what became of Yamamoto and Nakamura remained unresolved, despite periodic investigation by military historians interested in documenting unusual incidents from the war's final phase. No records emerged that could definitively establish their fate. Some speculation centered on the possibility that the two men had successfully evaded capture and managed to reach Japanese evacuation points before the surrender. However, the lack of any documentation makes this theory impossible to verify. Miller's own military service concluded in October 1945, when she was repatriated to Canada along with other medical personnel who had served in the Pacific Theater. Her final report on the Keiko incident was filed with the Army Medical Service Archives in Ottawa. The administrative file on Keiko's case was eventually transferred to the International Red Cross Archives in Geneva, where it joined thousands of similar files documenting civilian situations arising from the war's conclusion. Access to these files remained restricted for decades due to privacy considerations. Attempts by post-war researchers to locate additional information about the incident proved largely unsuccessful. The specific details documented in Miller's reports could not be corroborated through other sources due to the limited record-keeping typical of military medical facilities during the war's chaotic final months. The medical facility at Camp O'Donnell was decommissioned in December 1945 as part of the general reduction of Allied military presence in the Philippines. The site was returned to Filipino authorities and eventually converted to civilian use. Miller's personal papers, donated to the Canadian War Museum in 1978, included her handwritten notes about Keiko and copies of the reports she had filed with Military Medical Administration. These documents provide the most complete record of an encounter that defied standard wartime protocols. The notes reveal Miller's personal struggle with the moral and professional challenges posed by Keiko's situation. As a military nurse, Miller was trained to provide medical care within established protocols and chains of command. The unusual circumstances of Keiko's case forced her to navigate between professional duty and humanitarian instinct. Miller's documentation suggests that she viewed her encounter with Yamamoto and Nakamura as evidence that individual humanity could transcend the broader conflicts that divided nations. Their willingness to risk capture while caring for an injured companion contradicted standard assumptions about enemy motivation and behavior. The language barrier that separated Miller and Keiko became, paradoxically, a form of communication that transcended specific words. Miller's notes document their development of a basic sign language that allowed discussion of medical needs and simple emotional support. Keiko's response to medical care, according to Miller's observations, was complicated by her separation from familiar cultural and linguistic contexts. The young woman struggled not only with her physical condition, but also with the disorientation of finding herself dependent on former enemies for basic survival needs. Miller's advocacy for Keiko's proper medical treatment reflected her professional training, but also personal convictions about the universal nature of medical care. These convictions occasionally brought her into conflict with administrators who viewed resources as limited and priorities as clear. The improvised medical equipment available at Camp O'Donnell proved inadequate for treating Keiko's spinal injury. Miller's reports document her frustration with these limitations and her persistent efforts to arrange transfer to facilities with better capabilities. The question of pain management occupied significant attention in Miller's medical notes. Keiko's condition involved both the absence of sensation in paralyzed areas and the presence of significant pain in regions where nerve function remained intact. Available medications were limited and their effectiveness varied considerably. Miller's notes document a trial-and-error process aimed at finding combinations that could provide relief without compromising Keiko's mental clarity or overall health. The psychological aspects of Keiko's care proved as challenging as the physical medical issues. Miller's training included basic understanding of trauma response, but the specific circumstances of wartime injury and captivity created complications for which standard protocols provided limited guidance. Keiko's cooperation with medical treatment varied significantly from day to day. Miller's notes suggest that the young woman's willingness to participate in care routines was influenced by her emotional state and her concerns about the fate of Yamamoto and Nakamura. The absence of information about her companions became a source of increasing distress for Keiko as weeks passed, without any word about their welfare. Miller's attempts to obtain information through military channels proved unsuccessful and may have increased rather than reduced Keiko's anxiety. The cultural differences between Miller and Keiko created challenges that extended beyond language barriers. Different assumptions about appropriate medical care, patient autonomy, and the relationship between medical providers and patients required constant negotiation and adjustment. Miller's notes document her efforts to understand Japanese cultural expectations about medical treatment while also maintaining professional standards appropriate to her role as a military nurse. This balancing process required flexibility and creativity that her training had not explicitly addressed. The dietary requirements for Keiko's care presented practical challenges that reflected broader supply limitations at Camp O'Donnell. Standard military rations proved unsuitable for someone with Keiko's medical needs and cultural background. Miller's advocacy for appropriate nutrition involved negotiations with camp administrators who viewed special dietary arrangements as unnecessary complications. These discussions reflected broader tensions about resource allocation and the appropriate level of care for civilian prisoners. The physical therapy options available to Keiko were extremely limited, given the facility's basic medical capabilities. Miller's notes document her attempts to develop exercises and treatments using available materials and her own training in basic rehabilitation techniques. Progress in maintaining muscle tone and preventing complications from prolonged immobility proved slow and frustrating for both patient and caregiver. Miller's reports reflect her professional concern about the long-term consequences of inadequate rehabilitative care. The question of Keiko's ultimate destination remained unresolved throughout her stay at Camp O'Donnell. Administrative uncertainty about her legal status complicated efforts to arrange appropriate transfer to facilities better equipped for long-term care. Miller's correspondence with Red Cross representatives revealed the organizational challenges facing humanitarian agencies during the war's conclusion. The massive scale of displaced populations and destroyed infrastructure created logistical problems that defied simple solutions. The administrative processing required for civilian prisoners involved multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting priorities. Miller's notes document her frustration with bureaucratic delays that seemed to prioritize paperwork over human welfare. Keiko's own preferences about her future proved difficult to determine, given the language barriers and the emotional trauma associated with her situation. Miller's notes suggest that the young woman's primary concern remained the welfare of Yamamoto and Nakamura rather than her own long-term prospects. The transfer arrangements that eventually moved Keiko to Manila were completed hastily when transportation became available unexpectedly. Miller's final report suggests that she was not satisfied with the level of preparation for continued medical care at the receiving facility. The departure scene, described briefly in Miller's personal notes, reflected the emotional complexity of relationships that had developed under extraordinary circumstances. Despite their limited communication, both women had formed connections that transcended their official roles as caregiver and patient. Miller's subsequent military service included assignment to a general hospital in the Philippines, where she encountered additional cases of civilian casualties requiring specialized care. Her reports from this period reflect lessons learned from her experience with Keiko about the challenges of cross-cultural medical care. The broader lessons that military medical services drew from cases like Keiko's influenced post-war planning for civilian care in occupied territories. Miller's detailed documentation contributed to discussions about appropriate protocols for humanitarian situations that fell outside standard military medical procedures. The search for Yamamoto and Nakamura continued sporadically through 1945 as Allied intelligence units attempted to account for Japanese personnel who had not been processed through formal surrender procedures. The two men's disappearance represented the kind of administrative loose end that concerned occupation authorities. Local Filipino civilians interviewed during these search efforts provided conflicting reports about Japanese personnel spotted in the countryside during the war's final months. The general confusion and fear associated with the changing military situation made reliable witness accounts difficult to obtain. Some reports suggested that small groups of Japanese soldiers were attempting to reach evacuation points along the coast, where they hoped to find transportation back to Japan. However, the collapse of Japanese naval capabilities made such evacuation increasingly unlikely as time passed. Alternative theories proposed that some Japanese personnel were choosing to remain in the Philippines rather than face uncertain prospects in post-war Japan. This possibility created concerns about security and the potential for continued resistance activities. The documentation requirements for tracking individual cases proved overwhelming for Allied administrative units dealing with thousands of prisoners and displaced civilians. Cases like Yamamoto and Nakamura's often received minimal attention due to more pressing priorities. Miller's post-war service included assignment to medical facilities in Japan, where she encountered former Japanese military personnel undergoing medical treatment. Her reports from this period make no reference to encounters with individuals matching the descriptions of Yamamoto or Nakamura. The transition from wartime to peacetime medical service presented Miller with new challenges related to the treatment of former enemies who had become patients. Her experience with Keiko provided valuable perspective on the human dimensions of providing care across cultural and political boundaries. The medical community's post-war analysis of cases like Keiko's focused primarily on technical aspects of treating spinal injuries under field conditions. The broader humanitarian and cultural lessons received less systematic attention despite their relevance to future conflicts. Miller's career advancement following the war reflected recognition of her clinical skills and her ability to handle challenging humanitarian situations. Her experience with cross-cultural medical care became part of her professional qualifications for subsequent assignments. The administrative files documenting Keiko's case eventually became part of broader studies of civilian casualties during the Pacific War. Researchers accessing these files decades later found Miller's detailed reports valuable for understanding the human dimensions of wartime medical care. The question of accountability for cases like Keiko's occupied significant attention from post-war military justice authorities. The circumstances surrounding civilian injuries during combat operations often involved complex questions about responsibility and appropriate response. Miller's handling of the initial encounter with Yamamoto and Nakamura received scrutiny from investigators attempting to determine whether proper protocols had been followed. Her decision to approach armed enemy personnel alone violated multiple security procedures. The outcome of these investigations reflected broader tensions between military discipline and humanitarian considerations. Miller's commendation and reprimand embodied the institution's uncertainty about how to balance competing priorities in unusual situations. The precedent established by Miller's case influenced subsequent training for military medical personnel assigned to occupation duties. Her experience demonstrated the need for protocols that could address humanitarian situations involving enemy civilians and non-combatants. The documentation standards that emerged from post-war analysis of cases like Keiko's emphasized the importance of detailed record-keeping for both medical and administrative purposes. Miller's thorough reports provided a model for future practitioners facing similar challenges. The broader implications of individual cases like Keiko's for post-war reconstruction efforts received limited systematic analysis at the time. The focus on immediate military and political objectives left little resources for studying the long-term consequences of wartime trauma and displacement. Miller's personal reflection on her wartime service, documented in letters and diary entries, reveals the lasting impact of her encounter with Keiko. The experience challenged her assumptions about enemy combatants and reinforced her commitment to medical care as a universal human need. The mystery surrounding the ultimate fate of all three individuals involved in the initial encounter remained unresolved, despite periodic investigation by military historians and genealogical researchers. The absence of definitive records reflects the broader chaos and disruption that characterized the war's conclusion. Contemporary efforts to locate information about Keiko, Yamamoto, and Nakamura using modern research techniques and databases have yielded no conclusive results. The passage of time and the destruction of records during and after the war make such investigations extremely difficult. The site of Camp O'Donnell underwent significant changes in the decades following the war, with civilian development eliminating most traces of the original military installation. The specific locations where Miller encountered the three Japanese individuals can no longer be precisely identified. Local historical societies in the Philippines have attempted to document stories like Miller's as part of broader efforts to preserve wartime memories. However, the lack of corroborating sources makes it difficult to verify specific details about individual encounters. The irrigation channels and rice paddies where Miller first observed Yamamoto and Nakamura caring for Keiko were eventually reclaimed by Filipino farmers and restored to agricultural use. The landscape that provided the setting for their encounter was gradually transformed by post-war reconstruction efforts. Miller's military medical records were eventually integrated into broader studies of combat medicine and trauma care. Her documentation of treating spinal injuries under field conditions contributed to medical literature about wartime surgical procedures and patient management. The ethical questions raised by Miller's case continued to influence military medical training for decades following the war. The balance between professional medical responsibilities and military security requirements remained a subject of ongoing discussion and policy development. Research into similar cases from other theaters of the Pacific War revealed that Miller's encounter with Japanese civilians requiring medical care was not unique. However, the level of documentation she provided was exceptional and made her case particularly valuable for post-war analysis. The Red Cross archives in Geneva eventually received hundreds of similar files documenting civilian casualties and humanitarian situations from the Pacific Theater. Keiko's case represented one example among many that illustrated the human cost of warfare beyond direct military casualties. The linguistic and cultural barriers that complicated Miller's care for Keiko became subjects of study for military medical services, planning for future operations in foreign territories. Her experience demonstrated the importance of cultural competency training for medical personnel. The improvised medical care that Yamamoto and Nakamura provided for Keiko during their journey through the countryside reflected training and resources typical of Japanese military units operating without regular supply lines. Their actions contradicted Allied intelligence assessments about Japanese military priorities and individual motivation. The risks that the two men accepted while caring for their injured companion highlighted the personal bonds that could develop within military units, despite the broader strategic and political contexts of warfare. Their loyalty to Keiko transcended immediate concerns about personal survival and military objectives. Miller's documentation of her interactions with all three individuals provided insights into the human relationships that could emerge even between enemies under circumstances of shared vulnerability. Her professional medical perspective offered a unique viewpoint on behavior that challenged standard wartime assumptions. The administrative processing of Keiko's case revealed systematic problems with existing protocols for handling civilian prisoners who required specialized medical care. Her situation exposed gaps in planning and resources that complicated humanitarian response during military operations. The ultimate resolution of administrative questions about Keiko's legal status and medical care reflected broader uncertainties about post-war responsibilities toward civilian casualties. Her case highlighted the need for clearer protocols governing the treatment of non-combatants injured during military operations. The medical outcomes achieved under the limited conditions available at Camp O'Donnell demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of field medical care for complex injuries. Miller's documentation provided valuable data about treating spinal trauma without access to specialized equipment or facilities. The psychological aspects of Keiko's care revealed the additional challenges facing medical personnel, treating patients whose cultural and linguistic backgrounds differed significantly from their own. Miller's notes documented the creative solutions required to address basic communication and emotional support needs. The long-term consequences of inadequate rehabilitative care for patients like Keiko became subjects of post-war medical research. Miller's documentation of limited physical therapy options and their outcomes contributed to discussions about minimum standards for military medical facilities. The institutional support available to Miller for handling unusual humanitarian cases proved inadequate for the challenges she encountered. Her experience demonstrated the need for clearer guidance and resources for medical personnel facing ethical and practical dilemmas in combat zones. The broader military medical community's response to Miller's case reflected ongoing tensions between humanitarian ideals and practical constraints. Her detailed documentation forced administrators to confront questions about resource allocation and priority setting that they preferred to avoid. The training implications of Miller's experience extended beyond technical medical skills to include cultural competency, ethical decision-making, and communication under challenging conditions. Her case became a teaching example for subsequent generations of military medical personnel. The research value of Miller's detailed documentation became apparent only years after the events she recorded. Her commitment to thorough record-keeping provided data that proved valuable for multiple disciplines, studying wartime medical care and humanitarian response. The personal cost to Miller of her involvement in Keiko's case included both professional recognition and institutional criticism. Her experience highlighted the complex pressures facing individual military medical personnel asked to balance competing responsibilities under extraordinary circumstances. The precedent established by Miller's advocacy for proper medical care, regardless of patient nationality or military status, influenced subsequent policies governing military medical services. Her actions demonstrated the practical importance of maintaining professional medical standards even under difficult conditions. The questions raised by Miller's encounter with Yamamoto, Nakamura, and Keiko about the nature of enemy combatants and civilian populations continue to influence military planning for subsequent conflicts. Her documentation provided evidence that standard assumptions about enemy behavior might require modification. The humanitarian lessons drawn from individual cases like Keiko's contributed to post-war discussions about international law and the treatment of civilian casualties during military operations. Miller's detailed reports provided documentation of both successful and unsuccessful approaches to cross-cultural medical care. Until this day, military records from the final months of the Pacific War remain incomplete regarding the fate of small Japanese units operating behind Allied lines. Cases like those of Yamamoto and Nakamura represent hundreds of individuals whose ultimate disposition was never formally documented. Miller's encounter with 3 people whose lives intersected briefly with Allied medical services provides one documented glimpse into human stories that largely remain unknown. The administrative complexity of tracking individual cases during the war's chaotic conclusion meant that thousands of personal stories like Miller's encounter remained documented only in fragmentary records. The human connections that formed across enemy lines during moments of medical crisis represented experiences that official military histories rarely captured. Miller's final correspondence about the case, dated December 1945, acknowledged that she would likely never learn the ultimate fate of Keiko or the 2 men who had risked capture to ensure her medical care. This uncertainty reflected the broader disruption of normal record-keeping systems during the transition from war to peace. The Red Cross officials who processed civilian repatriation cases in late 1945 reported encountering hundreds of situations similar to Keiko's. Injured civilians separated from family members, incomplete documentation, and inadequate medical facilities created administrative challenges that overwhelmed existing humanitarian protocols. Japanese military records recovered during surrender procedures contained no references to Sergeant Yamamoto or Corporal Nakamura. Their unit designations, if they existed, had been lost along with thousands of other administrative documents destroyed during the retreat from the Philippines. The document recovery mission that had led to Keiko's injury represented one of hundreds of similar operations undertaken by Japanese forces during their final months in the Philippines. Most of these missions were conducted by small units operating without detailed documentation, making post-war investigation extremely difficult. Local Filipino civilians interviewed decades later by military historians occasionally mentioned encounters with small Japanese groups during spring 1945. These accounts, filtered through memory and translation, provided no definitive information about specific individuals, but confirmed that such encounters had occurred throughout the region. The medical facility records from Camp O'Donnell were eventually transferred to the U.S. Army Medical Research Command archives, where they joined similar documentation from hundreds of temporary medical installations established during the Pacific Campaign. Miller's detailed reports about Keiko's case represented unusually thorough documentation among these files. The site where Miller first encountered the 3 Japanese individuals was eventually absorbed into expanding agricultural development as Filipino farmers reclaimed land abandoned during the occupation. The irrigation channels that had provided concealment for Yamamoto and Nakamura were modified or eliminated as modern farming techniques replaced traditional rice cultivation methods. Miller's post-war medical career included assignments to veterans' hospitals, where she occasionally treated former Japanese prisoners of war who had remained in Allied custody for medical reasons. Her reports from this period make no mention of encounters with individuals who might have been connected to her Philippines experience. The broader questions raised by Miller's case about appropriate medical care for enemy civilians and the ethical responsibilities of military medical personnel continued to influence policy discussions for decades. Her documentation provided concrete examples of both the challenges and possibilities inherent in cross-cultural medical care during wartime. International humanitarian law developed after 1945 incorporated lessons learned from cases like Keiko's about the treatment of civilian casualties and the responsibilities of occupying forces toward injured non-combatants. Miller's detailed records contributed to these discussions by providing documented examples of successful and unsuccessful approaches to complex humanitarian situations. The mystery surrounding the ultimate fate of Keiko, Yamamoto, and Nakamura remained unresolved, despite occasional investigation by researchers interested in documenting individual experiences during the war's conclusion. The absence of definitive records reflected the broader chaos that characterized military administration during the transition from combat operations to occupation duties. Miller's personal papers, preserved in the Canadian War Museum archives, include her final reflection on the case written in 1946. She noted that her encounter with 3 individuals whose lives intersected briefly with Allied medical services had reinforced her belief in the universal nature of medical care and human compassion, regardless of nationality or military allegiance. The irrigation channel, where Miller first observed 2 Japanese soldiers caring for their injured companion, was eventually filled and converted to other agricultural use. The rice paddies that had provided the setting for their encounter were transformed by post-war reconstruction, eliminating most physical traces of the events that had brought 4 individuals together under extraordinary circumstances. Contemporary efforts to locate descendants of individuals involved in similar wartime encounters have yielded limited success due to the destruction of family records in Japan and the Philippines during and after the war. The personal histories represented by cases like Keiko's often disappeared, along with the broader documentation that might have preserved them. The medical techniques that Miller documented for treating spinal injuries under field conditions contributed to military medical literature about trauma care in austere environments. Her improvised approaches to pain management and basic rehabilitation became part of training materials for subsequent generations of military medical personnel. The cultural lessons embedded in Miller's cross-cultural medical care experience influenced post-war training programs for military personnel assigned to occupation duties. Her documentation demonstrated the importance of cultural sensitivity and language capabilities for effective humanitarian operations in foreign territories. The administrative precedents established by Miller's advocacy for Keiko's proper medical treatment became part of military medical service policies governing the care of civilian prisoners and enemy non-combatants. Her persistent efforts to secure appropriate care demonstrated the practical importance of maintaining professional medical standards regardless of patient background. The broader implications of individual cases like Keiko's for understanding the human dimensions of warfare continued to influence military history and medical anthropology research for decades following the conflict. Miller's thorough documentation provided primary source material for scholars studying the intersection of medicine, culture, and warfare. The questions about accountability and responsibility raised by Miller's encounter with enemy civilians requiring medical care contributed to ongoing discussions about the ethical obligations of military medical personnel. Her case demonstrated both the challenges and the moral imperatives inherent in providing care across enemy lines during active warfare. Until this day, the fate of Keiko Tanaka and the 2 Japanese soldiers who carried her through the Philippines countryside in March 1945 remains unknown. Military archives contain no record of their ultimate disposition, and Red Cross files from the period provide no definitive answers about their post-war lives. The human story documented in Miller's reports represents one brief intersection of individual lives during a conflict that separated millions of people from family, home, and familiar support systems. Her detailed accounts preserve a record of compassion and professional dedication that transcended the broader political and military divisions of wartime. The irrigation channels and abandoned rice paddies, where 4 strangers met under extraordinary circumstances, have long since been transformed by agricultural development and urban growth. The physical landscape that witnessed their encounter has changed completely, leaving only Miller's written documentation to preserve the memory of events that challenged standard assumptions about enemies, medical care, and human relationships during warfare. The administrative file on Keiko's case, archived with thousands of similar records in Red Cross repositories, represents documentation of individual human experience that official military histories rarely capture. Miller's commitment to thorough record-keeping ensured that one small story of wartime medical care and cross-cultural encounter would survive the broader chaos and destruction that characterized the Pacific War's conclusion. Today, researchers accessing these archives occasionally discover cases like Miller's that illuminate the human dimensions of warfare beyond strategic objectives and casualty statistics. Her documentation of 3 days in March 1945, when enemies became patients and professional medical care transcended national boundaries, provides evidence of possibilities for human connection, even during humanity's most divisive conflicts.